Welcome back to another episode of the Sacred Giggle podcast. As always, this is your host, Shishi, aka Ashish, aka the Cosmic Brown Boy from Space. Today is the day. I am so excited to share this episode with you all. I've been doing this show for almost 2 years. I guess it's been a year and 9 months. So coming up on 2 years soon. And I've had a lot of amazing conversations. I've been very blessed to speak to amazing artists, amazing healers, amazing coaches. But today's guest has probably had a more profound impact on my thinking and on my life than, well, I don't want to say anyone has, but he's definitely in the top 5 people who has influenced the stuff that I'm working on right now with regards to healing your inner child, working on your attachment, becoming more secure, building real self esteem from the roots. His name is George Haas, and he was a student and was mentored by the amazing Dr. Daniel P. Brown, who was a psychologist at Harvard and also Tibetan Buddhist Master, who I had the great privilege of working with as my therapist for a year and a half before he passed away. And Daniel was also George's mentor and passed on an incredibly powerful inner child reparenting technique that he developed called the ideal parent figure protocol. And George is now really the shepherd and steward of that technique. He's probably the best in the world at administering it. And he runs a masterclass with his company, Metta Group, that trains facilitators in administering that technique. It's been the most profound healing tool I've ever discovered in my life, hands down. It's the thing that has transformed me most as a human being. And I talk about it a lot. I'm designing a course right now for artists and creatives specifically that features that technique and is largely derived and based on George's teachings as a meditation teacher and also as a teacher of attachment theory and the features of secure attachment. So, buckle in, guys. I mean, this is really a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. I'm so excited for you to hear it. George is a wealth of wisdom, a wealth of knowledge. He's such a gentle, kind hearted human being. And he's really just done the work coming from a very difficult past of his own through healing his attachment disturbances and earning security himself, as he likes to call it. And in this podcast, you're really going to get a in-depth view of what it actually means to build your self-esteem as an adult, right? Like all these quotes on Instagram that we see about loving yourself and this is going to be your year and this is the year that you finally believe in yourself. And for years, I would look at these quotes and these memes and I would hear people talk about this and I would always say, well, yeah, I mean, that sounds nice to my cognitive mind, but how do you actually do that? Like, how do you actually do that in a way that lasts, that isn't just a peak experience, because you had some crazy experience on meditation retreat or with psychedelics or something, but is actually a systematic method that can help you do that. And of course, nothing against those other modalities that I mentioned. They've all been incredibly helpful. But for me personally, healing these attachment wounds has been the most important work I've ever done. So I'm so excited to share this with you. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like the episode, leave us a review, give us a follow. And if you're interested in the course that's coming up that I mentioned earlier about healing attachment wounds specifically for creatives and artists, you can go to the description of this podcast, wherever you're listening to it, and there'll be a link to sign up for my mailing list. And that's the best place to stay on top of when that course will be coming out. And one final note about the audio on this episode, we did record this remotely from different continents on opposing sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm in a new place. So I'm still figuring out the best acoustics and best place to set up in terms of my podcast. So please bear with us on the audio quality. It's not so bad that it disrupts the content, which is what's important. But there will be some moments when George and I might be talking over each other and it kind of drops out on one side or the other. So just wanted to call that out. But you guys and girls will be fine, I'm sure. So without further ado, here is my conversation with George Haas.
I've had 28 years of psychotherapy. So I knew that something was wrong. I didn't know what was wrong. I didn't know why, a smart, sort of articulate guy like myself could not function at all in the world. It didn't make sense to me, particularly with the extraordinary privilege that was given to me by my family. And I got to the end really of therapy. You've done amazing work. You've gotten everything possible out of this work that you could get. You're just going to have to live with how it is. And my thought was, well, what if it's not good enough? What if I can't live with it the way that it is? It's not good. Live one of those marginal lives where I barely get out of bed. That really was so painful a thought. I had already been meditating because of the advantages of emotional regulation and stress relief that comes from meditation. But when I came to the end of what was possible to achieve in therapy, I dived really hard into the meditation. And, like all things, you progress really fast in the beginning. So that freshman period is really enjoyable because, things get better and better and better. And then you hit the sophomore slump where the skills that are easy to develop, you've developed. The skills that you need to move beyond that are much harder to develop and take longer and more dedication. And somewhere along the way in there, one of my meditating friends said that they had heard a lecture by somebody that reminded them of me and that I should listen to it. It was Alan Shore, and he was giving a talk on disorganized attachment. And I listened to it, and in 10 minutes, he described the arc of my life with such accuracy. It was mind blowing. And then I thought, oh, this is it. I've discovered the problem. Now I can go get it repaired.
It's funny, I had the exact same experience with listening to you talk about I was like, this guy knows me.
There was no help anywhere because attachment theory was still in the research phase of things. And so, with no help anywhere, I decided, like all people who don't know enough to know that this isn't a good idea, I thought I would develop my own meditation based system of repair for attachment. So that became my personal practice. I was exploring the descriptions of attachment, view. Buddhism is really centered around view. So you understand what the view is. You understand how the mind is, how you create conceptual reality, and whatever view the mind is holding affects that creation. And that if you don't understand that you've just made this up, you act as if that's how it is. And then that's where the suffering comes from. Shinzen, who was my main teacher at the time, wanted his senior students to teach. So I was teaching, and I started teaching a class on his techniques, which did not have a lot of appeal in the community that I was in because there was not so much an interest in going deep as there was in improving the experience of being alive at the level that it was. But somebody came up to me and said, you used to be the angriest person I had ever met, and you're not angry anymore. And that actually was really interesting to me. Could you teach a class on overcoming anger? So I taught a class on overcoming anger. And then people came up to me and said, anger isn't really my issue. Fear is my issue. Could you teach a class on overcoming fear? So I taught a class on overcoming fear. And then people came up to me and said, anger and fear aren't my issues. Sadness is my issue. Could you teach a class on overcoming sadness? So I taught a class on overcoming sadness. And then people came up to me and said, anger, fear, and sadness aren't my issues. Shame is my issue. Could you teach a class on overcoming shame? And this big light bulb went off. I said, I know, I'll teach a class on overcoming difficult emotions, and I'll get everybody in one class. It's all the same. And so I taught that. And then people came up to me and said, it isn't the difficult emotions that are a problem. It's the relationships that cause the difficult emotions that are the problem. In the descriptions that I was hearing, they were talking about adverse attachment conditioning and how they can't understand why they can't have good relationships. And then that's the great sorrow for them. And so I started teaching the Meaningful Life course. When I went to trademark, it was already trademarked, so I had to switch it to meditation and attachment. And then I began to teach the class with this optimistic idea that if you taught people to mentalize, which is what Vipassana meditation is so good at, really tracking your thought process and watching how you create things, and that you give them an education on what secure attachment functioning is, that would be enough to change their attachment strategy. So I went up to Berkeley to study with Mary Main and Eric Hesse, and to really have a good sense of that and put together this curriculum. But after we'd done it for 2 or 3 years, it was evident that it wasn't working, that people were much more knowledgeable and that they could catch themselves, they could repair better, and that their relationships were operating in a more stable way, but that the internal experience was still the turmoil of insecure, disorganized attachment.
So do you mean that their actual relationships out in the world were exhibiting more secure features, but their
Right.
actual, I guess, relationship to those relationships internally
Was still difficult and painful, and the relationships were volatile, not stable in the way that they weren't coming apart and ending
right?
so much. We used to track who got married. That we've been teaching so long, we had to also track who got divorced.
Right.
Sometimes the divorces were a good thing, it's not always bad. So I started looking around to see if somebody else had a sense of what was going on. This is, 5 or 6 years or so into the process of this. One of my students said, "Have you ever heard of this guy named Dan Brown?" And I said, "No." And he said, "He has a book out. You should read it. It's about attachment." He actually called me and he said, "This guy Dan Brown, he sounds just like you." So I ordered the book. It was a tome, 800, 900 pages long. I put it on the shelf. Maybe 6 months later, his wife, who was a teaching colleague of mine, Jessie Morey, called and said, "Can you imagine an ideal parent?" And I said, "Sure, in a coffin." And she said, "Not your parents, George, an ideal parent figure." I said, "No, but let me see if I can try it." So I spent maybe 2 or 3 months on my own attempting to visualize an ideal parent figure, and I couldn't really do it, which was insightful and also alarming. If you can't imagine an ideal parent figure, it's easy to understand why you can't imagine an ideal partner in a relationship and why you always have to be on guard.
Right.
So I actually took the book off the shelf and read it. Actually, what I did is I threw it into my suitcase on my way to a retreat in case I was bored on the retreat, wanted to read something. And then I found it to be a page turner. I read it in like 5 days and thought it was awesome and recognized immediately that the piece that was missing from our project was the remapping of the database so that that unconscious process of forming conceptual reality would have different data points that it could use to create a different reality. If I find somebody who I think is really interesting, I try to get them to go out to dinner. And so I spent maybe 3 months sending messages to Dan Brown from every social circuit I could connect to until he finally called me and said, "Okay, I'll have dinner." And so I flew to Boston and we met at a Japanese restaurant. And we had this wild 4-hour conversation at the end of which he said, "You're the only person I know I can talk meditation and attachment." And so we started this friendship. And he was very helpful in coaching me how to integrate that ideal parent figure into the existing two pillars that we already had that worked pretty well. And so we have this meditation based 3-pillar approach where we do the ideal parent figure as the remapping of the perceptual database. We use the Metta-Vipassana meditation to develop mentalizing and emotional regulation. And then we have our classes that we use to teach how secure relationships are supposed to function. One of the things about people who grow up in insecure, disorganized attachment environments is they don't actually understand how secure relationships function. So you have to teach that.
Right. So the 3 pillars are this ideal parent figure protocol that you typically do with a facilitator who's trained in that, and then meditation and the actual education of what a secure sense of self and relationship looks like. And the IPF, in my experience, has been the kind of deep level rewiring of the way that you created reality based on previous experiences in your life that is now holding you back, and rewiring that so that you kind of let's say, don't necessarily get triggered as often by the same things as you do that work.
If you think of it, you have the capacity to sense. So in Buddhism, there's these six senses: touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and then there's mind. Mind is actually the activity of selecting what it is that you're going to pull from the environment to pull together to create your experience of the environment. That raw sensing data, which is a highly curated sampling of what's out there, is then compared to the perceptual database of previously understood experiences. And if there's a close enough match, that whole string of meaning from your whole life attaches to the experience of the present moment, and it unfolds into conceptual reality. If there's a novel experience where there's nothing in the database, then imagination is meant to fill in that gap. The reason that you keep creating the same situation over and over again is that's what's in the database. And each time you recreate it, that additional information is added to the database. And there's no way for you to create a different understanding of things without putting more data into the database. So you have alternatives in which to choose. And that's what the ideal parent figure does. You imagine these completely ideal outcomes. And then when the body mind looks at the present moment and scans through the data entries and it pulls out a completely ideal outcome, then you form a completely different reality than you would have formed otherwise.
Yeah,
What's really sort of cool about this is that the experience of yourself is unchanged, but you're doing completely different things.
totally. It's hard to understand how epic this is unless you do it, but I mean, it really is life-changing. It's like, you guys know me, the listeners of the show, like, I'm like a self-development junkie, and I'm always trying all kinds of stuff, plant medicine, meditation retreats, all that, regular therapy, breath work, and it's all great. But this has been the deepest thing, because you just start noticing yourself acting differently, like getting less triggered, being more confident. And, an example just to kind of highlight what George is talking about is, an example could be something like, if you felt like whenever you expressed yourself, it was kind of neglected or not seen, maybe by your parents when you were a young child, then, as George is saying, that might be the thing that gets put in that database. So now you're like a 32-year-old adult walking around the world trying to express yourself artistically. Just thinking of a random person here, no relation to myself. And
Nobody thinks that either.
right, yeah, your default state is that, whether you're conscious of it or not, this is why it's so deep. Your default is, no one's going to care about what I create. No one's going to care if I express myself. And so then you wonder why you have this creative impulse maybe to put something out into the world, and you're like, why am I dragging my feet on this? Am I lazy? Do I need to work harder? And really, it's just about, if you were to go in there surgically and just change that perceptual database, as we're calling it, with, oh, actually, when I express myself, I'm delighted in, and I'm encouraged, and I'm encouraged that I should be expressing myself, and that the world will meet it with approval and love. Then, it fundamentally changes the way that you go about doing that as an adult.
I like to think of it as resistance. If your expectation is that the world will be delighted with your expression, there's no resistance in putting it out. If you think that the world is going to be indifferent or that they're going to be hostile to your expression, then all of this resistance arises, and a lot of the creative energy is consumed overcoming the resistance.
Yep.
And so the streamlining of this, so that you get all of the resistances out of the way, so you just have all of that energy available for the creation, and then the freedom to express it.
And that's also a really good point about the creative energy getting burned up on investing basically in more of the resistance. And I think this is why, I mean, I've certainly gone through this. I think this is why a lot of artists or creatives or entrepreneurs, like anyone who's just trying to do their own thing and put it out into the world, burn out so easily. It's not necessarily because they're even like working that hard. Oftentimes it's just all the mental and emotional investment in that resistance. And it's just like the
Right.
not being able to make a decision about something, or procrastinating, and then beating yourself up about it, because that's another thing that can be learned in childhood. Like, if the way that you were trained by your primary caregiver to deal with a difficult situation was to basically like blame yourself, then you'll continue to do that. And then the ability to mentalize, which is basically take a step back from your experience and understand the way that you're perceiving things and making the world around you. As you grow that, you are able to deal with the moments when you inevitably get triggered. Like you're able to emotionally regulate yourself better as you practice the meditation.
So mentalizing there's a scale, it's 1 to 9. It's an exponential scale. So somebody who mentalizes at a 2 is at twice the capacity of a 1, or 4 times the capacity of a 3, or 16 times the capacity of 4. Secure people tend to mentalize at 6 or higher out of the gate, and then each of the insecure, disorganized attachment strategies do so less. Disorganized people mentalize below a 3. So you really can't process everything that's coming in efficiently enough that it doesn't consume a ton of energy just trying to figure out what's happening. If you grow up in a household that was really chaotic and unpredictable, you have to prepare responses to dozens of things, not just to one or two predictable things. And so all of your energy is consumed in preparing how to respond to something that might happen. And none of it is left for the exploration that would create the work.
Right. For someone listening, George, can we just define the 4 attachment styles, kind of just like high level: secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized?
So secure people tend to think of themselves as capable of getting their needs met, and they tend to think of the world as filled with people who will meet their needs. So that's how they go out into the world. Imagine that. Dismissing people think that they're the sliced bread, they're the bee's knees, and then they would be very happy to collaborate in a relationship with somebody who is able to meet them at their level. But since obviously everybody is below their level, they don't collaborate. They just take what they want. So they don't reciprocate in relationships. You take care of them, and uh, that's that. So they see themselves in this very grandiose manner, and they see everybody else as incapable. Um, Preoccupied people see themselves as incapable, but strangely, everyone else is capable. So all they need to do is convince somebody to take care of them, and then they'll be all right. So you notice a good pairing with the dismissing person. So the most common relationship is secure with secure, and the second most is dismissing with preoccupied. And then disorganized people think of themselves as incapable of getting their needs met, and they think of everyone else as a perpetrator or somebody whose intention is really ultimately to harm them.
Right. There's an added element of fear there for the disorganized people.
So they tend to self-isolate as a protection.
Right.
And then what we also have to look at is the accumulation of disappointment over a lifetime. Secure people, because they have functioning relationships, are able to weather the disappointment better because they have support. Dismissing people tend to flee from the experience of disappointment. They're always moving into the next thing. If something fails, they devalue it and move into the next thing. It's sometimes breathtaking how fast they'll drop something and move into something else. Preoccupied people don't explore, and so they're always having to hitch their wagon to somebody else. And so disappointment for them is a real issue. One of the things that happens is that over and over again, relationships fail. They don't mentalize very well, so they don't understand why they fail. And so sometime in the mid-30s, they begin to um, evaluate whether they should try again at something that's confusing and doesn't work, and then suffer the disappointment or simply stop trying to avoid the disappointment. So you'll notice that arc. Disorganized people, nothing has ever really worked for them, and the disappointment is crushing. And so they tend to be very anxious. That fearfulness you mentioned earlier, you'll notice a pattern of a lot of beginnings, some middles, and no finishes for disorganized people. And that's because the anxiety of being seen and becoming a target is so great for them that the closer that they get to realizing what they're after, the more anxious they become. And at a certain point, they fail intentionally to relieve the anxiety, even though the failure doesn't is painful and accumulates the disappointment.
Mm.
And so eventually they also stop trying because they can't bear the disappointment.
Yeah, and I think yeah, it's so fascinating because obviously everything you said obviously applies to relationships, but again, bringing it back to the creative life or the life of an artist, a lot of artists work alone, and I know for me, that's in a way is my comfort zone is just like when it's just me and my art and no one needs to hear it. But of course, there's a part of me that desperately wants to share it with people. Like it feels like it's part of my soul and I want it to be expressed. But if you're walking around with that wired belief that not only is it not going to be appreciated, but you actually might even be like hurt in some way or punished for sharing it in the case of disorganized people, then that's the root of that self-sabotage that I've certainly experienced. People listening have heard me talk about that a lot, of getting so close to finishing something and then just like jumping to something new. And
Right.
so it's just understanding that is the first step, and like it just gives you a little bit more understanding, and then you can start to notice it and then use the tools that we've been talking about in this show to start to repair that.
I have a concrete example of that. I have a book that I put out called The Lower Manhattan Dormitory Effect, which is a memoir of my time in New York.
Mm.
It took me 12 years to complete that because the anxiety of the expression was so difficult that I had to just take breaks from it. The book that I have out now called Punch Outs, it took 2 years to do because all of that resistance got put aside.
Right.
So I started life complexly disorganized. And what you're seeing is that a complexly disorganized person takes 12 years to make a book. And then when I earned my security, a secure person takes 2 years to make a book.
Yeah.
And this is 10 years of resistance and anxiety
Right.
that you don't have to have anymore. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm such an ardent advocate of all of this, because not having 10 years of resistance and anxiety is awesome.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the years and years, decades, in fact, of therapy that you did. And not to say that I'm sure they were useful for what they were useful for. But when you started working with this 3-pillar approach, the 3 pillars again being the ideal parent figure protocol, meditation, and then the learning of secure functioning, how did that compare to the therapy?
Well, I like to say that I worked with good people and we did good therapy, but it doesn't have much effect on the underlying attachment conditioning. At least not yet. Maybe there'll be some modalities that work better, but none of the ones that I did. And I did conventional trauma treatment that was very difficult and debilitating during the process of doing that. It was highly dissociative. So all of those things were helped by psychotherapy, but my orientation to the way that life was and what I could get out of it was the same, pretty much.
Yeah.
Fully operational, fully intact, hardly dented.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wild, because like we live in this age. I say this a lot. Like if you go on Instagram, for example, and if your feed looks anything like mine, because I'm just like following a bunch of things about healing and meditation, there's all these memes like, this is 2023 is the year that you're going to believe in yourself and like love yourself. And I mean, it's great. Of course, I'd rather that be on my feed than other things.
Yeah, no, I always want to put in parentheses. Love that. Exactly how am I going to do it? Close parentheses.
This is why this work is just so incredible. I feel like this is the how-to. This is like how you actually
Right.
do that. And it doesn't need to take years and years and years is the other thing. And I would love to hear you talk about that, just from people you've worked with or maybe your own story. Like, what is the time frame on this?
When I met Dan, one of the things I asked him was that if we could use IPF in our system and if he would help me make sure that it was working. One of the things that I insist on is that the stuff that we do actually works, because I've done so much stuff that didn't work and it felt like a waste of resources at the end. And I said, also, what I would like is if you would recommend somebody who would facilitate my IPF, so that I also like to understand the practices well enough through doing them that I really have a a way of supporting people when they do it. And he said, "Oh, I'll do your IPF." And so that was amazing. And so we began this journey where he was both facilitating my IPF and then talking about how it might integrate into our system.
Mm.
And in the beginning, you develop an ideal parent figure, a mother and a father, if that's what you end up with. It's, of course, there's no restrictions to what it looks like. But really, what you're attempting to touch into is what you wanted as a child.
Right.
Often not getting, sometimes you get it, but often the desire for what it would have been or what support you needed so that you could flourish as who you are. I had a mother who didn't like me. And so a lot of the qualities that later in life have become really valuable and people adore about me were completely rejected over and over again in childhood. And so I thought that those qualities about myself that are actually my virtues were undesirable. And then once you develop the understanding of what it is that you wanted, what it is that you needed as a child, then you begin to work with your current manifestation of the attachment conditioning. So we would call that triggers sometimes, or you have an activation of the attachment system where you feel threatened or you feel frightened or you feel abandoned. And then you work with those experiences from the present moment and link them to the childhood experiences where the original encoding happened. This kind of thing happens, and I interpret that as rejecting or abandoning. And then you have the ideal parent figures come in and remap it by not abandoning, not rejecting. And so what you're doing is layering in around the original entries in the database these alternatives that the body mind could choose. The body mind is very economical. It's always going to go for the lowest calorie response to something. And if you have a lot of high calorie afflictive responses in the database and you layer in these easy, secure choices, the mind naturally goes to them and then just creates the secure reality instead of the insecure, disorganized reality. Once you go through the activation process, which doesn't take so long, I would say 4 or 6 months is pretty reasonable range. Then what you want to do is go into the more difficult experiences of childhood. If you had trauma, if you didn't. People who are on the disorganized side of things have a lot of trauma. Trauma causes disorganization. If you don't have a lot of trauma, you don't tend to be disorganized, but you could be. You could have had neglect in childhood. You could have had inconsistent care in childhood, and that gets worked through. Then you turn to exploring. Dismissing people explore pretty well, but they explore for resources rather than for meaning. And so there's a reorientation in dismissing people away from simply acquiring resources. They like to transact relationships, so they need resources. That's their primary motivation.
Right.
Into actually finding meaningfulness in this human life that we're in.
And just a quick note on that, the example that always comes to my mind with that is, and let me know if you agree, George, would be the like super famous rock star who like kills himself because he's like super depressed. Like he was really good at getting there and exploring in that sense, but wasn't doing it for the right reason, or maybe was doing it to accomplish some other need that wasn't met in childhood.
We get into these ideas. Why do we want to be in a position of power and resource? Do we want revenge? Do we want to be able to transact? We're human beings. We live with the human condition, which means we need to feel connected. We need to feel seen. We need to feel loved. And if we don't have that, it doesn't matter what all of the rest of it is. If you're dismissing, of course, you can shut down that experience, but it is, in the end, unbearable to be disconnected from others.
Yeah.
So once you go through trauma, then what you begin to work on is exploration. What is it that you want to find out about this life that you have? What is it that's going to provide meaning for you? And we talk about it in primary and secondary exploration. Secondary exploration is the pursuit of resources to survive and maybe beyond that. And primary exploration is where you derive meaning. So, if you're in survival mode, you don't have the resources to really go for meaning. So you have a much more challenged life. But if you do have resources, then the exploration is around finding meaningfulness in life. And that varies quite a bit depending on who you are and what it is that floats your boat. And then once the exploration piece begins, we then look at relationship, ideal partner figures, who it is that you'd like to be in relationship to, and then ideal intimacy. What is it like to be in a securely functioning relationship? That goes hand in hand with the exploration because you need those relationships to support your exploration. So there's a period of back and forth between pursuing exploration and pursuing supportive relationships.
Right.
And then really the end piece is exploring any inhibitions that might be remaining in your exploration, that you can really pull out all of the resistances and be free in that. Then once the attachment stuff is done, which we consider preliminary practices, if you're meditating, of course, what's likely to happen is that the pathway to enlightenment opens up in front of you, and then you pursue the deeper spiritual sense of the human life.
Right. Meditation or going on a spiritual journey is a form of exploration in and of itself. And you could argue that it's one of the most challenging and deepest forms of exploration. And so if you don't have the ability to explore from a stable place, then I think that can be very disorienting for a lot of people.
And make it much harder.
Yeah. To me, those feel like two discrete goals, but they're intertwined, obviously, and I think they can complement each other. The one being the goal of, being a secure human being living on this earth in this plane, and then the other being the enlightenment or awakening.
Well, I call it a preliminary practice. So if you went into a Tibetan practice, you do 10,000 prostrations as the preliminary practice. If you went into a Theravada practice, you do some kind of concentration training as a preliminary practice.
Right.
All of the meditation strategies and techniques that you learn in pursuing secure attachment functioning can then be turned on the enlightenment investigation. There's no loss there. In fact, you get really good at the meditation techniques. You get really good at mentalizing, really good at emotional regulation, all of which are necessary to go deeply into the enlightenment side of practice. You hone these skills. It creates an experience where you have a social network around you that will support your practice, and you also have mentalizing capacity to see what's happening. So all of the things that you need in order to go deep, you develop in resolving the stuff that typically prevents you from discovering the things that you need to see on the enlightenment path. So you're much freer and much more capable then to hit the ground running when you want to go do that, rather than spending such a long period of time not being able to make much progress in that, the frustration that arises. And as you're probably aware, that most people abandon it before they get that far.
Yeah.
Also we're in the West. Can you imagine this? I went to Miramar looking for a retreat center I could bring a group to, and they assigned me to a monk. The deal was that I would help him with his English, and he would take me around to the meditation center and talk to me about life there and all the rest of it and how we might work out having a group come. And I asked him about his practice, and he said that he had been doing breath counting for 5 years.
Wow.
And that his teacher was not yet satisfied with the quality of his breath counting to move him into the insight practice. Know any Westerners who would put up with 5 years of breath counting before they got to do insight practice?
Right.
I don't. So you end up with this experience of jumping into the deep end of the pool and not being able to swim. And then a lot of the energy is just spent trying to stay afloat. Whereas if you come in and do the preliminary practices, which are organized around the attachment work, set up a group of a social support network that'll catch you if you get into trouble in your meditation practice, develop those techniques that you need, then you jump into the pursuit of those insights.
Yeah.
Which you may already have developed in doing the preliminary practices.
Yeah, well said.
And then really it's the frustration potential drops really low.
Right. And you feel secure and capable of doing it because you have a good
Right.
sense of self and you feel like you can do things that you want to accomplish.
You don't have to avoid the the dark side or the shadow side.
Right. Well, George, this has been amazing. I really appreciate you coming on. And I just want to personally acknowledge you for the impact that you've had in my life. Like I've said many times on this show, figuring out my attachment stuff and focusing on that has been hands down the most important personal work I've ever done. Like it's just the deepest stuff. It's just chronologically the deepest stuff if you want to just think about it from when you're born. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge you, George, and just keep doing the good work. And for people who are interested in learning more about you and your company, Metta Group, which I highly recommend people check out, where can people find all that stuff?
So it's metagroup.org is our website. It's all on there, including my book.
Yes. Everybody go check out George's new book.
All the classes are up there. If you need, we have an office. You can call the office. 213-378-0489 is our number. And take a look. We've organized the stuff we do as a level 1, which we're finishing up a level 1 this Saturday, but we have another one starting in March. And then we have a level 2. So the level 1 is sort of a skim across the surface of what all of this stuff is. And then level 2 is a deep dive into the stuff that you need to do in order to really affect attachment change. Level 3 is for insecurely attached or disorganized people to earn security. Level 4 is secure functioning relationships. So let's say you have security with some features, you could begin the level 4 stuff if you wanted. We have a level 5, which is when one person does attachment work, it tends to change the deals that they have in place if they're already in a relationship to somebody else. The other person isn't doing attachment work. Their expectation is that the deal should stay the same. And most of the time, if one person in a relationship does the attachment work and the other person doesn't, all of the premises for the relationship are going to need to be renegotiated. And sometimes couples have a hard time doing that. And so we have level 5, which is an attachment focused couples therapy. I mainly work with business people. So business people also have attachment relationships. So if you're like a founder or an entrepreneur and you're having trouble with the people in the founding team, we can do, couples work with the business people or business relationships. And I do a lot of work with siblings, as it turns out, in trying to renegotiate a better family relationship. But you could also do parent-child, to whatever you want to do. Not it's, the level 5 work isn't limited just to romantic partners. And then that's what we offer.
Amazing. Yeah, guys and girls, whatever your pronouns are, even if you heard all of this and you're like, none of that applies to me, I think I'm just the most secure person ever, I still would recommend that you check it out.
And you're probably dismissing and you should come.
You probably need it most and you're going to be the quickest fix. So, yeah, exactly. But seriously, guys, if you resonate with the stuff that I put out and everything that I talk about on the show, it's just all so informed by this stuff. I've taken the level 1. I'm finishing up the level 2 right now myself. I've worked one-on-one with George. It's amazing. And yeah, definitely check out the website. Check out George's book, Punch Outs. It's a photography book, but it's just super cool. It's integrating everything that he's learned on his meditation path with his art. So yeah, George, thank you so much for being you and being in my life. I really appreciate you. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I hope you all enjoyed that illuminating conversation with George Haas as much as I did. If you want to learn more about George, you can check out his company, metagroup.org, which has all of the classes and intensives that he was mentioning at the end of the episode there. There's a link to that in the show notes. And if you'd like to be notified about the upcoming course that I will be running, that is largely based on George's work, but applying it towards helping creatives heal limiting beliefs, get unblocked, and share their work, the best place to be notified of that is my mailing list. There's also a link to that in the show notes. And I would just encourage you all to really check out George's work, dive into it. If any of this resonated with you, and if you've been feeling what I've been putting out, I cannot recommend his work highly enough. Like I said, it's really changed my life, and I hope this conversation gave a lot of value to you all. Last but certainly not least, for those of you who heard this conversation and felt something deep inside you really resonate with what we were talking about, I am offering coaching in which I'm leading people through this ideal parent figure protocol and also helping them along with the meditation piece, the mentalization piece that George spoke about in the episode, and also the education around secure functioning attachment and relationships. I'm specifically helping right now creatives, artists, entrepreneurs, people who are serious about the work. It's only by application. If you would like to learn more about that and think that you'd like to work with me on a one on one capacity, you can find a link to apply for the private coaching in the show notes as well. Thank you all so much. I love you. Have an amazing day, week, month, and I will see you here in a week for the next episode of the Sacred Giggle podcast. Much love.